What is the
Monroe Doctrine?
By 1923, most of the Western Hemisphere was free from direct European rule. And US President James Monroe focused on this in his 7th State of the Union address. He spoke of his fear that Spanish and French powers would return to the Americas. President Monroe suggested potential US action if European countries decided to recolonize or take political control over newly freed American countries. This was a far cry from George Washington's policy of neutrality in international affairs. Monroe noted that European governing systems were different from the American experiment with democracy, and he didn't believe that these two systems could coexist in the same hemisphere, saying, quote, "We should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety." But side note, Spain and other European countries did have small colonies in the Western Hemisphere at this moment, and they continue to do so for decades to come. Monroe's statement was a reciprocal bargain. The United States would remain neutral in European affairs if Europe refrained from extending its political system into the hemisphere. At its foundation, the Monroe Address was a unilateral policy speaking to the fear of European colonization. Over time, while the original European threats faded, the address became doctrine and a guiding principle for US foreign policy. It was used as a tool to assert US dominance, legitimize intervention, and exclude rival powers. What if I told you that the Monroe Doctrine wasn't really powerful when it was written? And it wasn't even really Monroe's doctrine. In 1823, it was a weak warning backed by almost no power. Everything we think it means today came later, when it was used as an ideological tool to justify expansion, intervention, and empire. Its meaning has been defined less by Monroe and more by those who invoked it later. Through the 1840s, the Monroe Doctrine functioned more as rhetoric than policy, really depending on power that the country did not possess to fend off European colonial appetites. In the 1840s to 1860s, US leaders reinterpreted the doctrine to justify continental expansion. Essentially, US leaders shifted the meaning of the doctrine away from European anti-imperialism and towards US continental empire. The doctrine was then cited to justify manifest destiny, the removal of indigenous communities, the Mexican-American War, and even debates surrounding slavery. In 1863, during the French invasion of Mexico, the Lincoln administration reinterpreted the doctrine to mean that the US could engage with European conflicts in the hemisphere if it met their interests, but that the US did not have a moral or legal obligation to do so. Mexican leaders viewed the Monroe Doctrine as a failed promise. Since the United States did not enact the Monroe Doctrine at this time, since they were focused on their own civil war. While the US did eventually become involved in some diplomatic conversations, it truly was up to Mexico to expel the French. This episode taught Mexico that the doctrine's enforcement depended entirely on US power and willingness to act, rather than any international principles. In 1895, the Secretary of State, Richard Olney, reinterpreted the doctrine to mean that the US ruled the entire American continent. That year, the US used the Monroe Doctrine to negotiate a boundary dispute between British Guyana and Venezuela. The US Secretary of State claimed, quote, "The United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." He intended to establish the right of the US to involve itself in any territorial dispute between Latin America and European countries. There was no law that supported this, but President Cleveland decided to run with it. In this case, the doctrine was used as a selective tool of US diplomacy because it was in their strategic interest. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt reinterpreted the doctrine to mean that the US could police the entire Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt claimed the US had, quote, "international police power." Through the Roosevelt Corollary, he turned the Monroe Doctrine from a defensive policy against European colonialism into a justification for U.S. intervention throughout Latin America. From 1910 to 1930, U.S. leaders reinterpreted the Monroe Doctrine to support active imperialist actions. During this time period, the U.S. repeatedly intervened in Latin America through dollar diplomacy and military occupations in the Caribbean. The doctrine was now used to justify informal empire. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt reinterpreted the doctrine to advocate for hemispheric respect and cooperation. There had been a lot of backlash from the previous 3 decades of U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean. So FDR denounced them and developed the Good Neighbor policy, which fostered better relationships with Latin American nations through non-intervention, non-interference, and mutual cooperation. From 1947 to 1989, the United States government reinterpreted the doctrine to allow themselves to interfere in countries whose governments they disagreed with. This was the Cold War era, and the US government used the doctrine to further its Cold War aims. They staged coups, backed exploitative US businesses, funded militias, and trained military leaders, all in an effort to prevent Soviet ideology from infiltrating the hemisphere. In the 1990s, the US government reinterpreted the doctrine to be a symbolic assumption of US primacy. Although the focus on symbolism did not prevent President Bill Clinton from sending the US military into Haiti in 1994. For more than 200 years, the power of the Monroe Doctrine has not been in its origin, but in its reinvention. And that reinvention, it's still happening.
The Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Donroe document, I don't know. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. Won't happen.